Welcome, viewers, to the 6th episode of the Think Bad, Do Good podcast. Today, we're so lucky to have Julia Vu on the line with us. Hey, Julia.
Hey, Jonathan.
Julie is in Plymouth, not Plymouth, Massachusetts. Have you been to Plymouth?
The original Plymouth, Jonathan.
Have you been to the new Plymouth?
No, well, because someone just told me it's a rock. I was like, why? Why would I just go and see a rock?
Well, there's also Plymouth Plantation. So you didn't go to...
is there?
Yeah, see, this is like in your Kennedy School reunion, you can go to the Plymouth Plantation. You've never heard of Plymouth Plantation? Because you weren't 12 when you were there.
No, I haven't heard of Plymouth Plantation. But I haven't even been to, like, what is it? Like the Cape? Or like the nicer side of, of that area.
Yeah.
My geography of America is terrible. Maybe it's nowhere near.
No, you're exactly right. I just hope that nobody from Plymouth, Massachusetts heard you say that, to say that it's nicer where you are. But they probably know that deep in. So she's in Plymouth, England, which is in Sussex. Is that right? No. Devon. Oh, God.
Now I feel better about my geography.
Oh, gosh. Yes, you should. So Plymouth Plantation, for the record, and this is not what this podcast is about. Plymouth Plantation is this historical recreation. It's like those Renaissance fairs, and it's an historical recreation of Plymouth. So you can go and like eat meal and like see how they interacted with the Native Americans. It's quite cool. Yeah.
Oh.
So you missed out.
Is it kind of like that scene that they reenact in Boston, like every so often, like this kind of war scene of like the Brits attacking and
100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then like all the families sleep on one big cot, one big bed or whatever it is. Anyway, this is tangential, completely tangential. So thank you for joining us today, Julia. Julia is, as you'll see on the podcast page here in the links below, Julie's a non-resident fellow at the Belfer Center, where you were the director for the China project. What's the name of the previous thing you did there?
China Cyber Policy Initiative.
Right. Which for viewers, obviously, is like something China Cyber is something to be concerned about. And she has just led the production and publication of Belfer's National Cyber Report, or the Cyberpower Index, which is a study in countries' comparative cyberpower across criteria. So she's going to talk to us about that. But before we dive in, so you're at the Kennedy School, and you studied at Harvard. So you have this background in trade too. You had a career with the British Foreign Service, including a trade posting in Beijing right after the end of BREXIT. Tell us about that. What was that like?
Yeah, so I was I was moved to the trade policy team just after the EU referendum, and I was in a little bit of like two minds. So first, I was sad because I didn't want the UK to leave the European Union. And actually, I remember like I was in Beijing when the vote happened, and we're all in a bit of shock. So then we decided to do what we tend to do when we're sad during the work hours, which is to go and eat some dumplings. So we're at this, like, my favorite dumpling restaurant. It's really good. Din Tai Fung, you should go. Oh, I think you have some in America. And we're eating these dumplings. And then my Chinese colleague just kind of turned around to me and she's just like, what do you think of democracy now? and then I was just like, oh, that's too soon. And just like continued shoving dumplings in my face. But then, so I was moved to the trade policy team. And that's like a function that the UK hasn't had for 4 decades. And so like, I was a little bit curious. But I was in, like, our team was 6 people. I was surrounded by like amazingly talented diplomats. And we had this like shared mission of wanting to make sure that the UK isn't like totally screwed. But then we also had this shared like WTF is trade policy. So we had to like figure that out. And it was also a very interesting time because, the cybersecurity law of China was just being drafted and implemented. A month later, the AI development plan came out, all this like kind of discussion around what is the social credit system. So I was leading the trade angle on cyber issues.
Wow, that sounds totally fascinating and historical. So obviously, for those of us watching who aren't experts on trade policy, the reason why Britain hadn't had a trade policy in China for so long is because all of the trade policy was done through the EU. Is that right? Or is it through the customs union originally founded?
Well, no, trade is a EU competency. So like we hadn't had to do it in-house.
So that was sort of outsourced to the EU for the last 40 years.
Basically, yeah.
Huh. That's fascinating. So what was it like? But what was it like covering these issues in China at the time? Like, what were some of your top takeaways from your experience in China doing that work?
Yeah. Well, so one is that just generally from another country considering their commercial interests, there are a lot of challenges of the China market, right? There's a lot of market access barriers. It's a very like unlevel playing field for foreign competitors or foreign businesses. And then, I was trying to get my head around what that means. And then when the cybersecurity law came out and related things, like I have a social science background. Like at the time I'd been like a foreign policy nerd in China for like 7 years. And then you introduce these laws that have technical implications. And I could feel like it was important, but I couldn't quite understand, what are the policy implications? Like critical infrastructure, like what does data localization, what could it mean for like between countries and like competitive advantage, or like what's cryptography? So it was like, there was a lot of things coming to a head. And it was, I found it really interesting, but also I was curious to really get my teeth sunk into the more, specifically what the cyber policy side of things meant for UK interests.
Yeah, that's so cool. And that's why you decided to go to Kennedy School. Is that what your goal was?
Yeah, because I was like, okay, so I feel like this issue is here to stay. I don't know like a whole lot about it, but I'm super interested. So I wanted to find the place in the world where other people had thought about it more. And so I like found the Belfer Center at Harvard Kennedy, and they focus on the intersection of science and international affairs. So they've got a really strong track record on like nuclear policy, and Ash Carter's the head of the center. He's like a former DoD Secretary of State, and has a PhD in physics. Like, sorry. I know that.
It's not you. Clarifying for the world, you knew that. Of course you did. Yeah.
So I was just I like hung around there a lot when I got in.
It's amazing. I mean, I was there. I worked with Graham Allison as his course assistant in 2006.
Wow.
Yeah. Thanks, Julia. Thanks.
No, he is like, he's something of a kingmaker. So,
Yes. Well, he tried with me, and all I've done is become a vassal coming out of it. It was great. I mean, working for Graham Allison was excellent training for working for senior officials in government, because he he might appreciate this if he sees this, but he sort of acted like a senior official in government when he was running Belfer. He once asked me before a class, we did this whole thing we were doing policy memos. We wrote his policy memos for his course on foreign policy making. And there was some question about, and it was a case on the environment. And right before class, he says to me, he's like, if we drop a certain amount of barrels per day, like what's that going to do to the price of oil in Saudi Arabia? Let me know by class. And class started in like 6 minutes. And I majored in religion. I was like, come on, man. How am I going to figure this out? I can't figure this out at all. But it does have this sort of tradition of attracting the brightest minds and national security policy from across the spectrum. So you went there, and then you got a job working on China cyber coming out of it. Is that what happened?
Yeah, basically, because when I just rocked up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, at the time, Michael Solmeyer was the cyber director, and Harvard had just got this grant to start a track 2 dialogue, which is a policy discussion between the Belfer Center and a Chinese think tank. And so they just needed someone on the Belfer side to head it up. So I was heading up this track 2 between like former members of the PLA, Ash and Eric for Belfer.
That's awesome. That's such a good and important thing to do. Well, to the degree that you can offer lessons about that experience and your experience in the government throughout this conversation, I think will be good for us. Okay. So you've written this study. Actually, you seem to have attracted a remarkable amount of talent from across the British government, past and present, to help you with the study. So tell us about it. What were you trying to achieve, and what was its objectives? And for those who are watching, again, the link is right below. You can click on it. We'll reference it here in a minute.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's funny, really, because obviously, as we've mentioned, like I wasn't hired to do this, and this came up because I was, I think I'd just come out of an event, and I was with one of the other team members, Irfan Hamani, and someone I think in the talk had said, oh, you know, the cyber superpowers are the US, the UK, Russia, Israel, China. And then I was just like, I think we're just talking, and I was like, why? You know, what is it that makes them like super, tips them over the threshold? And like who's number 6? Like I never hear about who comes after those 5 powers. So we were just, you know, kind of, I think I was a student at the time as well as being the research director. And we're like, oh, we should write some. Oh, no. I just finished. I started the research director. He was a fellow. And I was like, oh, this sounds like a good report. We should write something together. And I'm pretty sure, like, at some point, I was like, you know, this is like, great. This will be like our first product. It'll take us 1 month. Right. and so this is like a year ago. Like, fast forward, add like 4 other like brains, thousands of strategy documents, like Excel spreadsheets, like, and a lot of like heated discussions. Here we are.
Excellent work.
So I'm really bad at estimating time.
That's excellent. You can ask Eric and Ash Carter sometime about how long I took to write the DoD cyber strategy. It was almost as long.
What?
Yes.
You wrote it? That's amazing.
No, it wasn't. It took too long. There were a lot of people involved, but yes. So, but that took longer than anticipated, the coordination process. But I think your report is more long-lasting and important. So
oh my God, I'm totally going to interview you for the next iteration. I'll be like, tell us.
Yes, tell us. Do tell us. But that's great. So it is a comprehensive report, and it obviously you've applied this element of social science rigor that I think is the sort of hallmark of the Belfer tradition. But I want to get into the study. And what do you think you really wanted to achieve? Was it sort of an assessment of like a database assessment of who they are, so you can make a clear statement? Is that the main thing, or was there? Let me ask this question a different way. Actually, you know what? Let me just dive into this one question here. Okay, you have a point in the report. It says the most comprehensive cyber power is the country that has 1, the intent to pursue multiple national objectives using cyber means, and 2, the capabilities to achieve those objectives. That's a great statement. So it's the most comprehensive cyber power is the country that has 1, the intent to pursue multiple national objectives using cyber means, and 2, the capabilities to achieve those objectives. Can you talk a little bit about what that means? How did you come to that formulation?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the comprehensive cyber power is our term for, like, you know, cyber superpower. And so this was, as it stemmed from that random conversation after the event, like this was us trying to figure out exactly what does it take to be like the most influential state actor in cyberspace. And so I guess perhaps the most interesting part of our framework is that we consider the different ways that over the years states have conducted activities using cyber means to achieve their national objectives. And so we identified like buckets of activities. And, you know, it's not just offensive that seems to be at the top of the mind of most people, and also like national defense. But there's also domestic surveillance, censorship, intelligence gathering, just making money, and also to shape like global norms, so like the UN and stuff, and also technical standards. So the first thing about this report is that we have said that states use cyberpower to do these 7 things, which is like new in itself. Like no one had has stated that as such in an academic context. And so for us, like the most comprehensive cyberpower is the one that can do and intends to do all of these things. So it wants to do them and it has the capability to do them. So I was trying to think of like how I could explain this most interestingly. Let me try it out on you. And if it doesn't work, you can cut it, obviously. So imagine you're a chef. Right?
Okay.
So if you're a chef and you've got like an empty kitchen, you're not going to be cooking anything. But if you're a chef and you've got some ingredients, then you can make some things. And if I saw those ingredients, they're going to kind of guess what you can make. But there comes a point, I think, where you don't know what the hell is going to come out of the kitchen until you know like the chef. So this is our inventory of, like what does the state want to do with cyberpower and what can it do?
Oh, that's so important. That's exactly right. I love that. When I first started working on cyber, it was after the Shamoon incident in 2012. Actually, it was right before. It was before Shamoon. It was after this other thing that happened that's been reported called Olympic Games. Just people have written about. So after that, I thought, okay, this thing has just happened. Chances are the Iranians are going to go after Persian Gulf assets. That's just like the first thing that came to my mind. And so I wrote a strategy paper about it. It's like, how do we help the Persian Gulf sort of shore up its cyber defenses? And it gets to your point right there. Like it was an easy extrapolation. It was the only time I've ever prognosticated an international event because a year later, obviously, they attack with Shamoon. And we hadn't done enough to help the Persian Gulf at that point. But it gets to your point because if you start with intent and the nature of the chef, then you can sort of imagine on the basis of past behavior what this hot power might do from a cyber standpoint. Is that about right?
Yeah, that's basically what it is. But the thing is, like a lot of indices, like military indices and other kind of indices in the past, don't really consider what is the state's like intent.
Yeah.
So exactly. But that's so cool that you prognosticated it.
It was the one time in my life I've ever seen something coming. And now I've told the world about it. So guys, send me money. So let's bring up your top 10 list. So can you just read out the top 10 for those listening by audio?
Sure. So top 10 from 1 to 10 is US, number 1. Woo! I showed this to, tangent. Showed this to my American family and like the response was just USA. I was like, okay. So 1 to 10. Number 1 is the US. Number 2 is China. Number 3 is the UK. 4 Russia. 5 Netherlands. 6 France. 7 Germany. 8 Canada. 9 Japan. 10 Australia.
There's some surprises in this list which I want to get into, but that's a great list, incredibly helpful. Can you tell us how are the US and China similar and how are they different?
Sure. So based on like our ranking, so there are like 7 objectives, as I mentioned earlier, and the US tops 4 of these 7 categories, and those are intelligence gathering, offense, norms, and information control. And then the China tops surveillance, commerce, and defense. But this is the calculation where we're looking at, do they want to do it? Can they do it? Right. But if we, and then we also offer some more data points in the report where we're like, okay, so what do they actually just want to do? And on intent, actually, China ranks higher, is number 1. So I guess in terms of like the current great power like discussion and stuff, and the fact that the technology and this kind of competition is the center of the US China like tensions, it seems to be. I think one of the things that people can take away from this report is that there's actually still a significant gap if we look at our assessment of capabilities across all of the objectives. Even though China comes second overall, it's still a substantive gap.
So what was the last point you made?
it's even though China comes second in this list of 30, there's still quite a bit of a gap between the US and China.
Yeah, there's a question I was going to ask later, but I want to jump ahead. Did you see any, like, in your research, did you find any sort of core investment areas that were driving the top tier players to elevate? Like, did there have to be a certain amount of education in information technology, or were there ever like tech companies clustered in a certain business or region, like here in Silicon Valley? Or were there personnel trends that you noticed from an investment standpoint over time from a government? Or maybe you didn't look at those drivers as you did the assessment. I'm just curious if it came up at all.
Yeah, no, there were definite. So let me just have a look. So you obviously not obviously, but you did rank highly if you had a lot of, large international technology companies. Also, we noticed a trend in strategies across the board where like governments were developing specific, cyber defense and offensive teams. So there's like specific resources being put aside to grow those capabilities in the military and across government. Another thing I think is that some people might forget is that our index considers how cyber capabilities can also be a weakness. So a smaller attack surface, like a large attack surface on our ranking actually counts against you, right? Because it's harder to defend. And so, for example, I think that's probably one of the reasons why Singapore ranks very highly on defense, and also the Netherlands.
That's why Singapore ranks highly, because it has a smaller attack surface? Is that why?
Yeah.
That's fascinating. So the smaller attack surface of Singapore and the Netherlands is what elevate them into the top 10.
Well, so Singapore's not in the top 10.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I think I've gone on a tangent.
No, you're doing great. That's perfect. Sorry. Singapore's not. Where is Singapore? What number is it, Jim?
So overall, Singapore, let me just pull up the longer list.
You didn't go on a tangent. I put in an alternative fact and moved them onto the list.
So Singapore is actually pretty far down the list. But on defense specifically, I think it's in the...
We're getting a really good shot of Julia's ear at the moment.
Sorry, I forgot that there's a camera there.
There is. We're definitely not cutting this. We're not cutting this. It's too good.
I can't really... Sorry, this is very small. But I remember when we were going through the assessments and stuff... that was something like how much connectivity, like they were both good and bad points in our ranking.
Well, what's interesting is the US, comparatively, US and Japan and the UK, if I was guessing, last time I looked at these statistics was a little bit ago, would be the three of the most popular, user populace on the list. France too. So the US must have invested really significantly in other areas to counteract the sheer size of its attack surface.
Yeah, I mean, the US trumps super strong in a lot of areas that kind of lifts the overall average. Because when we're talking about the 10, we're talking about across all of them. So that's why it's a bit of balancing out.
And so what has the Netherlands done? This is just mind-boggling to me. It's like cyber weed. Is that what makes it to me? It's no longer unique. It used to be that in Amsterdam, that's why they went there to get stoned. But now...
Now I get it. God, I'm so slow.
Yeah, but so this is fascinating. I mean, windmills, that's not going to do it. Sorry for all of our colleagues watching this. I don't mean to be a jerk. So small attack surface, but what have they done to differentiate themselves to get up? What number are they? 6? Is that right?
No,
never mind. They're on the list. They're on the list. What have they done to get there?
Well, so yeah, I mean, Netherlands is probably one of those powers that we would classify as a high capability, but perhaps slightly lower intent. But they're still in the top 10, right? So, that capability they have a strong capability in other areas that are not traditionally associated with cyberpower. So the reason why most people are like, oh my God, the Netherlands is there, is because most people associate cyberpower with offensive capabilities. And it's not like you hear every day that the, like Dutch are attacking everyone. But, it's actually very openly signaling that it plans to develop cyber capabilities. Like, it has a very specific cyber strategy. Like, it's clear who owns it, what it seeks to do. It's up to date. It has resources delegated to it. And the thing is, to score highly, you need to not only, as I said, like, have the intent, but there also needs to be like some demonstration that you've like can do it or have done it. So that's why it's up there. And actually, they're really establishing themselves as like a kind of thought leader, particularly in Europe, on like cyber norms. We're actually presenting this paper at their cyber conference later this year.
Cool. So, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, that's really neat. So when I look at this ranking, I immediately think about competition, particularly for potential adversaries, right? And given your background on China, I have so many questions about each country on here, but I think for the viewer, and given your deep expertise on China, how do you see the U.S. and China managing their long-term cyber relationship? And maybe part of that answer is just about the relationship overall, but I'm curious if you could offer thoughts.
Yeah. Well, so this is basically drawn from the Track 2 dialogue work that I was doing. So one of the reasons why we had funding to do it anyway was because both governments weren't really talking to each other. So they needed like an avenue of communication. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that people tend to do in these forums, is a very common tool in diplomacy, is try to get a better understanding of the other person's strategy. Like, what are the lines of communication and who makes the decisions on each side? And, in the event of like a crisis, the point is to avoid any kind of unnecessary escalation in crisis. And there are a number of these different kind of dialogues that happen. But I think one of the most unfortunate things is that currently US and China competition, like communication, is so bad. So, for example, earlier this week, you probably didn't even come across your radar, but like the EU and China had their summit. Like, President Xi Jinping dialed in to a call with like Angela Merkel and like Ursula von der Leyen, Charles Michel of the European Union, to talk about, for God knows how long that Zoom call was, to talk about like trade and investment, climate change, like everything that matters to the EU and China that happened between them. Whereas and that was the second time they did it this year, right? So in contrast, every single like high level US China dialogue over the past few years has just dropped off the diplomatic calendar.
Yeah.
And like the emergency talks, like Pompeo met with Yang Jiechi in June in Hawaii, but that doesn't count because emergency talks have a very narrow set of talking points. Mm-hmm. And, as you know from working in government, like these kind of like big pieces get the whole machinery of government together. Like they get to see all of their strategy, like interests lined up. They can figure out what are the key, what can they afford to negotiate with, develop a strategy. And, that's just not happening on this side, at least it seems. And so I think that if channels of communication aren't reestablished, then, people have already said that tough on China is not a strategy. Like, you need to have these kind of other issues in order to find areas to collaborate. Mm-hmm.
So tell us a little bit, if you can, about the degree of Track 2 communication between former government officials or senior folks in business, and not just from the Harvard standpoint, but if you have a competitive understanding of other Track 2 programs, how are things going?
So there are a number of other Track 2 dialogues between the US and China that focus on cyber and like related issues, like, I don't know, digital governance or something. Yeah. But and they all, so one of the interesting things is they all clock into different parts of the system, right? So on the Chinese side, they'll be partnered with a different think tank that clocks into maybe a different ministry or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so that's really useful because, the Chinese government is not like many other governments, is not totally linked up. So you need to get a better understanding of like what is driving each ministry, who's doing what. And then the point is like, ideally that you kind of piece all of these pieces together and get a better understanding of China. There is like a handful, I don't know, maybe like 10 US China dialogues. And just before I kind of wrapped up this position at the Belfer Center, it was like the first time that we all got on a conference call together to like exchange, insights.
Oh, good.
Yeah, I mean, better late than never.
Yeah, that's right.
But
yes,
and
trying to be positive.
really...
It's 2020.
but there is like that kind of expertise and like those kind of slightly more informal relationships.
Yeah.
But the truth is, like, even though they have existed over the years, my read is that actually there's less activity. It's much harder for senior officials on both sides to travel to, but even before COVID, like they would get hauled up at immigration if they had links to the PLA, and you kind of want to be able to speak to these people, but both sides, people are finding it hard to travel to communicate, and funding for Track 2 dialogues is also being cut.
Really?
Yeah.
That's pre-COVID?
Yeah. So, and I think that's a real shame. I mean, there is a criticism of Track 2 dialogues that they can just be like talking shops and stuff. And I mean, that is true. That is true. It really does depend who's around the table and what is the global context. But if we can get the right people around the table, like this is the time that we need to have these channels of communication. And it just seems incredibly short-sighted to me that that they've kind of cut funding for it. But there's also this like political. I think there's the risk some people don't want to be seen as engaging with China because there's a huge it's kind of like tainted in a way, because you could very easily be like then put in a soft on China box.
Oh, for sure. That's so ironic. I mean, it reminds me of the 50s or the sort of McCarthyism in the United States. It's like it's really easy to for certain domestic leaders or domestic actors to pigeonhole you in that way. So I haven't told you this, but in 2010, one of the reasons why I got into cybersecurity, I started as a counter-extremism expert. I did a major in religion. I studied the Middle East, looked at counter-extremism. And when I entered the Obama administration, working for Jim Miller, and I got a top secret clearance, and my son's contributing. That's when I learned that China was taking apart, was stealing IP. And at that point in time, with Cyber Command standing up, like we were extremely focused on China. Russia was much less of a concern. Iran wasn't even on the table. North Korea was just something everybody was terrified about, but hadn't, like Iran and North Korea in particular, hadn't invested. And we had the first strategic and economic dialogue where it had gone on under the previous administration, and we decided to include cyber within it. And just getting cyber on the docket took forever. It took forever to get the Chinese to agree. And they finally agreed. Or maybe they didn't agree. Maybe we were just asking if we could raise it. I can't remember. Like, there's a lot of work on the U.S. side that had to be done initially. And there was a deputy secretary of state who will remain nameless, who at the last minute, I stayed up until 3 a.m. working the talking points to raise this issue with the Chinese. He at the last minute, he's like, we can't talk to them about it. So it was initially this sort of fear of raising it with them that we would offend them, because we had to confront them about intellectual property theft. And ultimately, that's what happened with the help of Mandiant. A few years later, the government said, look, we know you're doing all this theft. So that's like, there's been this evolution from a cyber standpoint in the relationship, but there was a real hesitancy to talk about it. And now, of course, we've got this decoupling, which now that I've moved to California, I've had to make much more effort to understand, because people don't talk about it all the time around me. But from a strategic standpoint, it makes me think about World War I. It's like, if you decouple, even like, so, Britain and Germany in World War I, they were close allies and they still went to war. Now we've got this major disruption with China rising in Asia. Is now really the time to sort of sever levels of communication? I don't think so. So what strategically, as you look at the relationship, what would be your recommendations going forward for, particularly around emerging technology and cyber, for the two countries to be able to avoid going to war? It's a loaded question.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot, and it wouldn't just be about like setting up these, like, for example, reviving that kind of cyber dialogue. Actually, when Trump first came into office, I think DHS still had its kind of high-level cybercrime dialogue with one of the Chinese ministries. But like, I feel like I would focus very much on like the US kind of figuring out exactly what emerging technologies, like down to the components, it thinks is most important for its future security. And there's a lot of information gathering as to, in terms of decoupling and supply chains, like who is currently leading in that area at the moment. There's a lot of mapping that needs to be done, I think, to a very granular level, before we can really think about how to negotiate with China and how to go forward. Like, but I mean, on a people thing, like, the kind of restrictions around students and researchers, I think, is a really bad idea. Like, I mean, anecdotally, like, when I was at school at Harvard, I remember thinking, in a lot of the classes, like the bad guy in the story was always China. And I was just thinking and there's a lot of Chinese students, right? And to be honest, like, the Chinese students that are in the classrooms are probably the ones that are most international and outward looking. Mm-hmm. And if they spend the whole time in America feeling completely alienated, it's like one massive kind of soft power opportunity just kind of gone. I think was also like, did you guys like cancel all the Fulbright scholarships as well? Like,
probably, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, these kind of long-term people links are like just being severed.
Mm-hmm.
And there are so many things that I would do. Like, I'm a huge nerd on technical standards and stuff, and like what's happening there in terms of like geopolitics, like that's kind of thing where I think we should really look into who's doing what, as well as using the Development Financing Corporation to fund more infrastructure projects in developing countries with allies, because obviously the US doesn't have all that industry.
Wait, can we pause on that? You're not saying in China, you're meaning external, like in third-party countries?
Yes, because I think, like, there's like, what, 48% of the world that isn't connected to the internet yet?
48%, really?
Yeah. It's 48% of the world not connected to the internet. And over the past 20 years, not just through the Belt and Road Initiative, China has focused extensively on, being trading partners with these countries and developing, like, providing infrastructure of all kinds. And whereas in contrast, the US has not really gone in there to provide infrastructure, from a US business perspective, it's like high risk, whereas, there's the whole China kind of debt trap thing where they're funding a lot of these contracts as well, but that also gives them like a strategic in into these markets. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the infrastructure you find in these developing countries are provided by Chinese suppliers. And for me, in the long term, I see this as like a strategic advantage that the US has kind of like not really got a look in at the moment. But I have to say one thing that is pretty good. Like, in a couple of years ago, I think Trump signed into an act, the BUILD Act, which is basically kind of reshaping US's overseas development financing mechanisms, which means that now you have like 60 billion to fund infrastructure projects in developing markets.
Yeah.
Not just for like technology, mm-hmm. And like help US companies compete in order to win these contracts. Yeah. And so that's like another like arm of it, like the kind of how can US China like the US like navigate this competition with China on like the cyber front. There are just like so many angles from like development policy.
Yep. We a colleague and I, Arun Mohan Sukumar, wrote a book-length study called Asian Cybersecurity Futures a couple of years ago. And the Belt and Road Initiative, it's too long. No one read it. It's like 100 pages long. If anyone read it,
I'll read it.
Yeah. Oh, thanks. It'll put you right to sleep. The executive summary might be worth reading. It's also a little bit dated at this point. But the Belt and Road Initiative, these recommendations were exactly what we were concerned about, that China's doing this massive amount of investment, and it's going to affect other states' cybersecurity behaviors and their views on data and their views on privacy. And there has to be some sort of diplomatic push from the U.S. side. Now, on the other hand, like this is sort of like a softer power level of influence to ensure that the Belt and Road Initiative doesn't lead us to getting completely cut out whatever China ends up doing, right? There's a bunch of pluses and minuses. So, well, there's a bunch of benefits with us sort of paying a lot of attention to it.
Yeah.
However, let me also ask, like, China is doing egregious things. Like, there's no doubt about it. Like, what's going on with the Uyghurs, Xi Jinping's consolidation of power over the military. There is clearly this sort of, like, to a degree, their behavior is not contributing to us staying on the path of peace, right? So we have to sort of balance our investments strategically at the same time for in case things do go sideways with China in a way that we don't want. How do you think about that problem set and Xi Jinping's behavior and the regime overall?
Yeah. Well, I agree, of course. But I think that in terms of how, I feel like we should be dealing with these issues within international structures where possible, or creating international structures that function better. Like there are so many problems with the world right now, but I actually quite respect, no surprise, the EU way of dealing with it, which is tackling these difficult issues like the awful treatment of Uyghurs and the national security law in Hong Kong front on, at the summit this week, and like. If the US, I think particularly on like the US can't do it by itself, I think. So there's a lot that the US needs to do with allies. And one of the best forums in which to do with allies is like international like governance, which is, and I feel very sad when I think about, the US kind of turning away from engaging internationally on these issues. Because I think the kind of self-harm it does is it makes the US lose legitimacy by not operating within these structures. And that kind of legitimacy and that soft power and like respect as a global leader is actually quite fragile. Mm-hmm. And I think that and it's something that in contrast, China is operating in these international institutions pretty sophisticated.
Very sophisticated.
Yeah. And this is like a narrative that America and in Europe has driven over the years, like this kind of international governance, like rule of law, and multilateralism and whatever. It's if the US chooses not to operate in it, it kind of like shoots itself in the foot.
Yeah, totally.
So.
Yeah, I mean it's 2020. It's easy to sort of look at the world and wring our hands and be worried about the future, like quite easily. I have faith in all these institutions, right? I have faith in institutional memory. I have faith in like the fact that there are all these good people who are watching out for this and like who don't want these pathways to come forward. So hopefully, no matter what happens in November, what you're talking about will change, right? Like it doesn't look like there's like it's a path towards success. On the other hand, like being hard on China, what are the benefits that we've seen from President Trump being hard on China? Do you see any benefits there?
Well, I mean, I don't disagree actually, with the criticisms of China and all the things that it has done wrong. I just don't think that the method is the best way. I also think that it's not a full enough response to a country that there's a whole like range of interests that are kind of just falling to the wayside because we're focusing on like three things. Mm-hmm. And I don't think it's sustainable.
Right.
And it's probably more damaging, I think, to like I really do think the soft power thing and the global leadership and like how the rest of the world is viewing the US is a really important thing that needs to be protected.
Yep.
And a lot of that has been, and it's not just of the way like Trump has treated responded to China, it's just generally Trump, unfortunately. But hopefully, like whatever happens in November, there'll be like a more comprehensive consideration of like what's going to happen over the next 4 years, because I really do think it's a critical point for like the US to kind of come back.
Mm-hmm. Oh, completely. Yeah. I mean, it's an anxious moment here in this country. There's no doubt about it. And that's something that we talked about with your colleagues, Siobhan Gorman and Robbie Mook, on the disinformation campaign discussion. So for folks that are interested in that topic, we have a full treatment of it with one of Julia's colleagues. The one thing that I remember at the end of there were a couple of things at the end of the Obama administration that powered me forward, one of which was the climate agreement, which my college classmate, Brian Deese, helped negotiate, working with China and India in particular, and gaining agreement between the U.S., China, and India on the Paris Accords to decrease emissions, and really setting quite an aggressive path. After the fires here in California this week, like that to me trumps almost every other issue, no pun intended. But like to solve the climate problem makes cybersecurity and so many of these other issues, which are significant and require management from a deterrence and escalation standpoint. But if we could solve the climate problem, it's like, hello, that would, like, I'm willing to put a whole bunch of other things on the table to get back to that point.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There are things where if the US and China work together, they can do a huge amount of good. But there doesn't seem to be like the political will at the moment to do it. Yes.
Yeah. Gosh, this is a darker note to end on than we probably should. Is there something positive we can talk about? Yeah, actually. Yeah. Thank you for doing this cyberpower report, cyberpower index, but National Cyber Index. Is that right?
Thank you for reading it. I wasn't sure anyone would.
Yes. I mean, this is always the view when you publish these deeply thought out academic papers. But thank you for your work. Thank you for all you've done for international peace and security in your career, and that you're going to do going forward. It's exciting that you're in the UK. So if you had to pick between Plymouth, Boston, and Beijing right now. Let's assume a sunny day. It's sunny in all three places. Which one would you pick?
I can't say. I would choose Plymouth.
You would choose Plymouth. That's probably just a safe call. You don't want your parents to throw you out of the house.
I'd go to Beijing for dinner. I come back.
Beijing for dinner. Yes, totally. I've only been there once. I was supposed to be there for 2 weeks. Such a beautiful city.
It can really be beautiful.
Yeah.
And vibrant. And the people are actually very, very nice.
When I first went to China, that was when I realized that like the Chinese could eat America's economic lunch in a heartbeat. It was like, I've never seen a group of people that are working so hard and seem so driven and motivated. Also, the Japanese whiskey is incredibly affordable.
Oh my gosh, yeah. They've got if you go again, I can give you such a good list of like where to go and all like the hidden Japanese bars and like the ones that are just populated with just Japanese customers. And you're like, yes, this is the place. It's legitimate. And they fly in their fish every day from Tokyo. So.
Oh my gosh, that's so great. Yeah, well, hope to go back someday. Okay. Anything else you want to share before we sign off?
No, not really. I'm kind of like, I'm just very thoughtful now of all the questions on the U.S. China stuff. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Yes, of course.